All right, here we go. Welcome once again to the online Peace Science Colloquium. This is our second installment of the fall in 2016. And today and I'm Emily Hinken-Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced. And I am the coordinator of online speaker series for the Peace Science Society International. And the idea behind this series of presentations is to bring more peace science to the world, to be able to present new work and get feedback on work that's ongoing, as well as to kind of advertise work that is hopefully forthcoming. So today we have a presentation from Meredith. She is a graduate student at the University of Michigan. And she has a project entitled Dancing in the Dark, State Allocation of Forces, although I don't have the title in front of me, so hopefully that's close to correct. State Allocation of Force and Conflict. And joining us today to discuss this paper are Patricia Sullivan, an associate professor at the University of North Carolina, or Koren, who is an assistant professor at the University of Minnesota. And we also have Phil Arena, a lecturer at the University of Essex. And so we are going to have a presentation from, oh, sorry, Aura.
I'm not an assistant professor as of yet.
Oh, okay. Oh, I just assumed. Wow. Welcome, and we're very excited to have your feedback in this project. So we are going to start with a presentation from Meredith, who is going to share her slides with us, and then we will open it up for comments from the our discussants. I'll also note at this time that if anybody who is watching online, whether now live or afterwards, if you have comments that you'd like to raise, you can put them on the comment section in the YouTube page, and then we can either try to address them now or Meredith can address them afterwards. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith.
Great, thank you. And yeah, the most important part is the Bruce Springsteen song, Dancing in the Dark. So this is a section from my dissertation project on information challenges that the state confronts and state allocation of force in civil conflict. I'm going to give a brief outline of the puzzle, which is, again, that security forces, there's a variety of security forces in civil conflict. So why do we see the variation that we do? And sometimes the choice to pursue strategies that seem irresponsible or destabilizing in the long term. To answer this question, I'm going to present a new theory on security force allocation. I'm going to emphasize the key role of information challenges that the government confronts, and that variation in these information challenges actually drives the variation that we observe in state allocation of force in civil conflict. And to test key hypotheses related to this theory, I'm actually going to present new cross-national time series data on internal security forces that I collected. It covers 4 decades and 3 different types of security forces, so pretty excited about that. And finally, I'm going to present evidence that these information challenges that governments confront do in fact influence the internal security that we see. So just getting back to the puzzle here, the project is really looking at the question of, when faced with civil conflict, why do governments look beyond their military? Why do they pursue strategies with other types of armed forces and a variety of paramilitaries? So just to give an example, in its counterinsurgency campaigns, Turkey did in fact employ a regular military, but alongside the regular military, it actually had a relatively nationalized and well-armed gendarmerie. So this is a national armed force that has jurisdiction over both security operations and internal policing. And then alongside those 2 security forces, there were also local village guards that were relatively localized and had lighter armaments. So how do we explain this behavior and these variety of armed forces deployed in civil conflict? Well, conventional wisdom on state projection of force, both internally and externally, tends to rely heavily on the regular armed force, rather than looking at the entire picture of coercive options. More recent literature has started to explore paramilitaries, especially pro-government militias and paramilitaries with respect to counterbalancing. However, it also treats very different units as the same. So oftentimes putting in the same category things like local village guards with these more nationalized, heavily armed gendarmerie. And theory on how states behave in civil conflict also tends to be based really heavily on state capacity. So in this conventional wisdom, there are strong states and there are weak states. Strong states are going to rely relatively heavily on the regular military, and our weaker states are going to rely on less regulated, less well-armed amateur options. However, this traditional perspective on it doesn't really get at the question of why we see variation even among weaker states. And it also doesn't get at examples like Turkey, where we can see village guards co-located with the regular military and operating right alongside them. So again, the question here is why, if you have a regular military, would you continue to use and rely on these other paramilitary options? Alternatively, I'm going to turn to two other bodies of literature that really emphasize the security environment that states operate in and the information challenges that the state faces. So both work on counterinsurgencies and civil war, along with work on civil-military relations, emphasizes that governments confront information challenges, that they have incomplete information and incomplete knowledge over, for example, the events in conflict or over their own security forces. However, to date, there really hasn't been work that examines the presence of both of these challenges, even though in any situation in civil conflict, states also have to figure out what rebels are, what they're doing, and they also have to know about the actions of their own forces. So today I'm going to talk to the information challenges that governments confront by bringing together these two literatures and looking at two separate information challenges. So again, the first information challenge that we expect governments to confront is one about the local environment and the external rebel threat that they actually face. So in this classic rebel information problem or identification problem, governments have incomplete information over who rebels are, when and where they're operating, and local basis of support. Now, to complicate matters, the state's own security forces, its regular army, can be particularly ill-suited to collect intelligence and information on rebel forces. The regular army and other nationalized forces, these consist of personnel that can be recruited and from anywhere in the country. They may not have local knowledge or local information about operating in the terrain. They may even lack language capabilities that are required to have them interact with certain populations. And finally, regular armed forces that are explicitly wearing uniforms of the state might dissuade civilian populations from talking with them, who are distrustful of the government or fearful of rebel retribution. So the government confronts, these information challenges. It needs to collect information to wage effective battles, but there are barriers in its way. Now, unfortunately, this is not the only information challenge that governments confront when engaged in civil conflict. As emphasized by the civil-military relations literature, the government also confronts problems associated with monitoring, coordinating, and controlling their own security forces. So it has emphasized through principal-agent dynamics, government principals have incomplete information over the actions of their security agents. And oh, by the way, security agents may have divergent preferences from that of the government principal. So government principal security agents might engage in activities that the government doesn't necessarily want. It might fail to carry out certain orders, as in the case of shirking, or in the worst case scenario, security agents may engage in behavior that is directly harmful to the government itself. For example, as in the case of coups. So there are actual internal challenges within the internal security apparatus that can threaten the government. Now, to a lesser extent, when governments are just deploying units farther afield or having to coordinate across specialized units, it can still be hard to monitor and receive information on what your units are doing. So there are both these information challenges that governments confront, one related to rebels and another one related to security agents. So how does it attempt to resolve these issues? Well, governments in civil conflict, of course, have limited resources and budgets, so they can only maximize personnel so much. So I argue that they actually rely on different types of internal armed forces to address these different challenges and can allocate personnel accordingly. And I look at two dimensions of internal armed forces here. The first is the extent to which armed forces are more or less regulated under the state. More regulated armed forces are explicitly associated with a government authority or administration and exercise legitimate use of force within the state. And then there are also, another way we might think about this is the extent to which they are more or less nationalized within the state. So more localized armed forces are going to operate within a narrow geographic region or area. They might have only local or regional jurisdiction of operations. In contrast, more nationalized forces tend to be able to be trained and recruited from anywhere in the country and then operating somewhere else. They have national jurisdiction, so they can be deployed throughout the country. And so in the project and in the subsequent coding work, I look at different types of armed forces that can fall within these different categories. So for example, less regulated localized forces, these can be like the village guards I spoke about earlier with Turkey. And here I'm going to be portraying it with Legos. So again, these militias are less regulated and also tend to operate within a specific geographic region. You might also have more regulated state militias that fall under a specific government administration. So the Soviet Union had a wide variety of state-managed militias, same with China. Now I'm going to turn to the other aspect, the nationalization. You can have less regulated nationalized forces. If we think about Praetorian Guards, like those in Iraq, they really don't have that many regulations, and they tend to be loyal to a specific leader rather than to the government as a whole. So again, here, these can be Praetorian Guards. And finally, there are more regulated nationalized armed forces, like gendarmeries that France, Italy, Turkey have. And these tend to operate under Ministry of Interior and Ministry of Defense, tend to be well armed and have greater logistics abilities, like air or paratrooper units.
4 minutes, Meredith.
Thanks. So governments can use these different types of armed forces to address these different challenges. Now, in addressing rebel information challenges, these localized, less regulated armed forces can be pretty well suited to actually address this. Again, they are from the environment, they do have local knowledge, they do have local language capabilities, and can have access to key pockets of civilian support. And this is exactly what Oman did during the Dhofar Rebellion. But this doesn't mean that you want to use militias at all times for all purposes. Again, because they are less regulated, it is harder for the government to control, monitor, and manage them. So when security agent problems are paramount, I argue that the government will actually turn to more regulated, more nationalized armed forces, like gendarmerie, where there is clear accountability back to the state, where there are hierarchical chains of command that allows transmission of information both from government principals to commanders to lower level units and back up the chain. However, again, as this shows, gendarmerie well suited to being coordinated and deployed might not be great when it comes to confronting information challenges related with the local environment. And so there might also be tensions in these two requirements. So I test two hypotheses. One is that rebel information challenges are associated with relatively greater personnel in militia, relatively fewer in gendarmerie, and that the security agent monitoring challenges are associated with relatively greater gendarmerie and relatively fewer militia. And for security agent monitoring challenges, I look at both deployments and then also internal risks like coups. To test these hypotheses, I use a panel of civil conflict entries, and for the dependent variable, I use my new data on the three types of internal armed forces. And just quickly, these include gendarmerie and state militias. And I include state militias to get at whether or not it's just regulation or localization driving this. Happy to talk about some of the descriptive statistics later. And real quick, to measure rebel information challenges, I look at populations with regional autonomy. To look at security agent monitoring challenges and the potential for coups, I look at conflict distance from the capital, which is from the PRIO conflict site. I also look at coup risk, robustness checks. I include previous coup attempts, and a host of controls to account for some confounding factors and state capacity. And what I find across my models is that these for rebel information challenges, so populations in autonomous territory, is positively and statistically significant when it comes to private militias. And for my measure, at least on distance, that is positive and statistically significant when it comes to gendarmerie. So for about an every 10% increase in autonomous populations, we might expect to see a relative increase in about 1.6% of militia personnel. And as conflict's distance increases from the capital about 10%, we would expect to see a little over a 6% increase in personnel in gendarmerie. Just to give you an idea, for Colombia, if we have a 10% increase, that's about 6,000 personnel. So what I find is that rebel information challenges do appear to be associated with an increase in militia. However, these agent monitoring challenges, specifically distance, are associated with an increase in gendarmerie. And so what this gets at is this idea that these two different information challenges likely influence the subsequent state allocation of force. For next steps of this project, I want to look more at the relationship between both logistical constraints and these principal agent monitoring problems, which I do think are closely related, and then also incorporate measures on my fourth category, which is Praetorian Guards, and finally look at the role of these security forces both prior to and post-conflict. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Meredith. And now we can open it up for any kinds of questions or comments. Phil. Phil, you're muted. If you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry.
That's okay.
So I really enjoyed the paper. I thought I would just start with some small stylistic things because that's what Emily asked us to focus on first, and we'll build up to the more substantive. So one thing that I thought was just really small but would make a little difference is I wasn't entirely clear on what your argument was in the first few pages. It wasn't until really the hypothesis section that I knew exactly what you're arguing. So just clearer language in the abstract in the first 3 pages would help in the review process. And along similar lines, I didn't really know what some of your terms meant, which may just be that I'm not as intimately familiar with this literature, but you have a very nice, clear definition of what you mean by gendarmerie and various types of militia when you get to the operationalization. But I would have liked to know what gendarmerie is a little more clearly before I got to the section of the paper where you're operationalizing things.
You put in a footnote what you're looking at about what you're considering to be a militia or a paramilitary, and that's an important definition. I'd stick it right in there. Oh, you're muted. You're muted. There we go.
Technology is evil. So firstly, I thought I really like the topic. You know, it's desegregating a topic that desperately needs to be segregated. I would second Phil's argument about the concepts. I think that, you know, it'd be good to introduce them in advance. I also felt, I mean, when I was watching a presentation, the hypothesis makes perfect sense to me. Right now, they feel like there's a separate section, and you kind of develop all this great argument, and then you kind of disconnect and go to the hypothesis. I think that if you integrate them into your discussion of the specific unit, especially in light of this discussion, that can both much better. And kind of another question I had is, you seem to really kind of try to avoid talking about the state capacity stuff. I mean, you mentioned it, but you know, a counter argument would be, well, what you're actually kind of looking at is still those state capacity measures. You know, so okay, well, you have all those ethnically autonomous groups. Well, what it actually represents states in like India that can't really establish control over those groups. Oh, not interested. And so that's something else that I was wondering, because I think, you know, kind of a strong connection with that might give it really a big, you know, much broader scope. And kind of, I thought, like, what are your thoughts about
that? Yeah, so no, thanks for the feedback, and also all the suggestions about putting the concepts up front. I think I always have them in the back of my head and doesn't necessarily get translated to paper. And yeah, also the suggestion about drawing more directly from the state capacity issue, I think is right on, especially given how important, you know, both regional autonomy and I think a lot of these logistics factors actually really do play a role, and those are both intimately related to state capacity and, you know, state projection of also its public infrastructure and its public institutions, and things like roads really matters. And yeah, so that point is taken, and I think I might be doing myself a disservice by not necessarily addressing it right up front and putting that with the theory, which is really where I see these information challenges crouched in, right, or these broader capacity issues.
Yeah, I mean, you're having like this alternative basically to state capacity, or a different view of it, and I think that's a great contribution. And so if you can actually show, well, here's what, you know, kind of step to step what state capacity argument makes, and here's why information problems are actually more likely to be a bigger problem. And then you can actually also incorporate it maybe into empirics, if you want to talk about empirics later. And I think that would give it kind of an extra, you know, kind of a bit of a broader scope that would really make it kind of selling it to those people.
Yeah, no, that's well taken. And one of the challenges I've had is I really wanted to address that different weak states resolve their problems differently, and I think I haven't been able to get that quite across just yet. Thanks.
Patricia.
Yes, I also really like this project. I think it's great, and I think you're onto something, and you're starting in a good direction. So I just had a couple of things, pieces in the theory that are less convincing to me, and then a couple things about the theory testing, the hypothesis testing. So I completely understand your argument about local versus nationalized forces, but I'm not convinced by your argument about why more regulated forces would be less able to get information. And you mentioned something about wearing uniforms, but if it's just about the uniforms they're wearing, then I don't understand why, you know, why the state can't just change the uniforms, right? Or why is it that not regulating is associated with getting more information, and regulating means less information? So that's a piece. And I think, you know, we were talking about state capacity, which I think is a really big piece here. And so when we're talking about less regulated, all the examples that you use just seem very strongly to be about the state not having the capacity to really regulate. And monitor those groups? And you use the Columbia example with the AUK, and your theory speaks to this very deliberate choice to allocate among these different types of forces. But with the local less regulated, and even the national less regulated, the state often doesn't have a lot of control over how many people are in those forces and what they're doing. So I think you need to develop that piece more. And then for the hypothesis testing, when you were speaking and also in the paper, I hear a lot of increasing this type of force relative to this other type of force, or putting more in this type versus the other type. But when you're testing it, you're just looking at as far as I can tell, you're just looking at absolute numbers in these various types of, rather than relative to anything. And so I'm wondering if your dependent variable might need to be more about ratios or some sort of relative measure.
Yeah, no, thank you first for these comments that are very helpful. And yeah, point taken about state capacity and less regulation. So I think you're right. I think in a lot of these cases, the government, what has actually happened in a number of the cases I looked at, these were where security agents were previously insurgents and flipped for whatever reason, they're in this new space. And so they do have knowledge that armed forces that were just aligned exclusively with the government for a while wouldn't necessarily have, and it's also the case that the government, if it could supply really great, for example, special operation forces, it probably wouldn't need to rely on tribal home guards. And so I think that is an issue. And I'm wondering if one of the ways to help get at that more is addressing the fact that the government is having to choose between these different options to address this problem, and that it does still end up using these particular types of village guards over other solutions. But it is still crouched in the idea that, if it had really great special operations forces to do this, that it probably would. So definitely expand that more. For the less regulated national forces, I can see that applying also to more roving paramilitaries like the AUC in Colombia. And I wonder if there's a different logic to, for example, the Praetorian Guards like in Iraq, where there was an explicit and very purposeful divide of what was otherwise a regulated armed force. So I'm thinking about maybe teasing that out more. That was still really helpful. And then finally, the question on the hypothesis. Yeah, so these numbers are logged, but they are still based off of total personnel. I included measures for all the equations. I also included measures of the other armed force personnel. And then I also looked at, which I'm hoping to include in the next draft, seemingly unrelated regressions. So the idea that personnel in one force is related to personnel in another force. It sounds like that might actually be a more persuasive specification or a more appropriate specification for this.
I'm gonna use my MC prerogative and insert myself, and then I've got Phil and Aura. I think that that Trish's points about the capacity to regulate is really important, because of the something that I felt was that I couldn't understand when I was reading it, was the connection between the information problem and the way in which this solves it. And in particular, if the problem is agency loss, right? So if there's a lack of information because there's a gap, an information gap between the state and its agents, then how can it be that they can just regulate, right? Like if there's a reason why there's agency loss, why are they then? Those seem almost like agency loss is definitional in the lack of regulation, and then you argue that regulation is the answer. So I think a clarification of how agency loss comes about and then how regulation is different and works as a solution to that would be useful. Phil, and then I'm going to go to Aura.
Well, first, I just want to echo what Emily was saying, because one of the comments I was going to make is that I also felt more persuaded by the argument about irregular forces being about information, but didn't quite see how you're solving an information problem with your regular forces by having more of them. That felt like you're trying a little too hard to say that both hypotheses are driven by the same thing. And I see the informational argument drawing off Calavis and Leala and all the literature you cite for why you would want irregular forces when you're dealing with an ethnic minority in an autonomous region. I'm not seeing how building up regular forces and a gendarmerie helps protect you against a coup, and your results don't seem to show what you expected in terms of coups anyway. So I feel like maybe you should just move away from that part of the argument anyway and say that sort of just the baseline is you want the smallest and most loyal to you force that will get the job done. And you move away from the baseline of a small force that will get the job done that's loyal to you when A, they're not going to get the job done because it's not big enough, so then you get a larger gendarmerie, or when regular forces aren't going to get the job done, and that's when you get an irregular force. And I feel like that would explain both of your effects better than saying that it's about solving a coordination problem in principal agent and coups and whatever. It's just you want people that you trust, and you don't want to have to spend too much money on hiring too many people that you can trust, if that's enough. And if that's not going to do it, you hire more people. And if more of the types of people that you trust the most isn't going to do it, you go to people you trust a little bit less. And I don't know if I should save this for later, but I had a tangentially related comment that's getting a little more into the testing, but also related to this argument.
Go ahead, Phil.
Okay. So the other comment I had that is getting more into the empirics is I wasn't quite sure why it's particularly interesting to look at how far away the farthest conflict region is. I think it might be more interesting to really flesh out your argument to look at the number of regions that are rebelling. And it might be that if you have two regions that even between them don't add up to a large amount of square kilometers, are very far apart, that's going to require a nationalized force in a way that one region, even with a fairly large square kilometer coverage, would not necessarily require a nationalized force. You could respond with localized militia or even irregular forces. So I thought to really get at your sort of trichotomy and test about when you need to nationalize, you should be looking at how far apart the conflicts are if there's multiple. Or just are there multiple in it?
Why don't we take Aura and then have Meredith respond?
Right. So I actually had two comments on the empirics as well. The first one, I think that considering that you are measuring the number of personnel, I would say the very least you want to include country population annually in your model. Otherwise, you have no idea of knowing whether this is just because of natural population growth or so. In fact, I might remove the other drum, like the using the other security forces stuff into just a robustness model. Or if you're doing later, if you're gonna do the structural equation or whatever you measure, that's fine. But I'd say go for kind of simple. And if the population is like, you can even have a really basic model, right, with just explanatory variable population, something like that. You see here, this is a based on specification the result of the goal, and then kind of add to it. You can also alternatively maybe normalize the size of the organization you're measuring by population. That's another way of maybe getting close to the ratio stuff. But I mean, usually simpler is better, especially if you're doing over less, kind of very nuts and bolts. Just put the population in there. I think could really help, both to kind of preempt some of the things. The second issue I had relates to, I always kind of bring it up, but that's endogeneity, right? And so, more people in autonomous territories, you have more people that can just participate in local militias, right? So, okay, well, I have a larger, Xinjiang, whatever it is, I have more people who participate in militias. So, the size might be affected by the fact that there are many people. But again, it might not have anything to do with information. Again, it could be regime capacity too, right? The government, the locals have to defend themselves either against, even against government forces. Here are their own. The changing distance is the same thing, right? So it might be that the distance to conflict is larger simply because the country is stronger, right? And so it's not because of the gendarmerie itself, but again, because the state is stronger and can kind of fight that. So again, we have, I think, some ways of maybe thinking about it, exogenizing those variables. So if you're again think of a good instrument, I'm not sure why would be a good instrument here, because you can really use geographical variations because using that, but maybe something that does vary by the use. It might not be a big deal when you submit it, I think just when you think of the mechanism.
So first, Phil, that I think sort of hit what I would like to think is sort of some of the basic idea of the broader project head on, which is, governments are really trying to deal with the most cost-effective security option that is going to get the job done and is also not going to destroy them in the process. I think, Fieber calls this the problem, what was it, the basic problematique, civil-military relations. So yeah, definitely going to be thinking about more of that, especially because it does seem to be the case that, gendarmerie are probably more expensive than, for example, your local state militia, but, under certain circumstances, you are going to need more mobile units that are more expensive, per unit, but are also more able to get the job done under, certain challenges of conflict. So
Can I stop you right there? So I think this is the key to really bringing everybody on board with this. So something that I feel I think what you just said was the clearest statement of what the problem is that the government is dealing with in its decision making, and that doesn't really come across in the paper. So the government is in a situation, right, in that the government has a rebellion on its hands, or an insurgency, or violent protests, or whatever the case may be, right? There's a conflict between the state and its people, okay? And then there are information problems, but it's not super clear how those information problems relate to that core conflict, right? So from your discussions, it's not clear what the salience of these information problems are to the government because they're not connected to the conflict, right? So are they just trying to get the job done and put down the conflict, as Phil suggested, which is why you would want localized militias or very regulated, nationalized, right? So are they just trying to get the conflict done? Or are they more worried about trusting their agents for one reason or another? What are the costs, the cost trade-offs in choosing one or another, right? Why would you be limited in what you could choose? And why is it that and how is it that those information problems relate to the core problem, which is the conflict? You see what I mean? So it would help us to understand why the government is thinking about this as a tension. Why is the government thinking about this as a trade-off? Why can't we just deal with this information problem and this information problem? Why can't we just have everything, right? So I would like to hear a little bit more about that. I'm sorry, you can go back to the other comments that you were.
Yeah, no. This is all really helpful, and so yeah, I think I need to get across more that I think these sort of resolving these different types of information or gathering, for example, information or knowledge about who rebels are or where they're likely located. That is all an attempt to put down, right? That is part of the broader strategy that states can put down rebellions. it's really hard to put down a rebellion if you don't know who the rebels are and if you don't know where they are. So these information challenges are part of the state's effort to eliminate these challenges. And I think, yeah, getting more at, it might be the case that turns out you're able to get a force that is really, really loyal to you, that, you know, they're really good at protecting you. They may not necessarily be able to fulfill all these other roles that you need in, again, putting down conflict and putting down rebels. And it can, you know, bring up other challenges as well. So I think maybe needing to talk more about that, those elements, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I've got Patricia.
Yeah, I think one of the pieces that is somewhat of a small issue, but also just is related to some of what Emily was talking about, is it's not totally clear to me where special forces fit in. Sometimes you talk about them as if they're paramilitary, and then sometimes you seem to imply that they're part of the regular armed forces, and of course in our country they are part of the regular armed forces. They're not paramilitary. So, and it seems like in many senses, special forces that are part of the regular armed forces would be the perfect solution. But many states don't have the capacity to actually create those types of units for various reasons. So I'm wondering if you could explain a little bit more about how you think about special forces and where they're fitting in your model.
Go ahead and answer that real quickly, and then we've got Or.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So I do think of special forces as either part, in many circumstances, part more of this, you know, more regulated, nationalized, well-armed, elite special unit versus kind of just versus, for example, the AUC, which I don't think most people would classify as special force. And right. I see them actually fitting in as along more the role of gendarmerie, and I would actually love to see how often they are deployed in low intensity, sort of these very low level civil conflicts. My expectation is actually that they and gendarmes are oftentimes doing similar roles. And it might just be that gendarmes are deployed because they also have, you know, explicit internal jurisdiction, that they oftentimes have the authority to get involved in these in security operations internal to the state. But I think they would behave very similarly. And I actually think that in cases where we see, for example, gendarmerie special forces that some countries have being deployed, special armed forces associated with the military would fulfill a similar role. So these are still both relatively well-armed, professionalized, more expensive units. And I didn't explicitly code them in the military balance because it was really hard to figure, it was more difficult to figure out which units they were. But that being said, I'd be really interested in pursuing that. And if they do, in fact, tend to correlate with the way that these other types of internal special units are used.
Or?
All right, so I have one question on the theory and one on the application. So about the theory, can you explain a bit more why localized militias, right, kind of are complement rather than staff? Because I think that, again, it relates to all the questions up, but I would like to hear more about why they're not as, because again, you know, most literature currently do assume that they are a subset rather than. Oh
wait, sorry, can you speak
I'm
up?
sorry, yeah, I'm having a hard time hearing you too.
Oh, sorry. I said, can you explain a bit more why, like, localized militias are a complement rather than a substitute? right? It relates to the questions that have been asked here, but I think that, again, we go back to the kind of like current literature, or whether about state capacity or other, would usually assume that those are substitutes for some purpose. That doesn't have to be substitute for everything, but say if you want to kill civilians, that might be a substitute instead of the military, right? And so that kind of maybe elaborate more about that. In terms of the empirics, so again, related to my previous question, did you try running it with population control? And then another question I have is with the lag effects. So you have a model there, I think, with contemporaneous variables, non-lag variables, and then the results in respect to the gendarmerie, the gendarmes are actually changing, right? So instead of distance to conflict, now it's, trying to remember, I think it's conflict intensity, which is negative, which again kind of suggests that what you're actually capturing is the other, it's the opposite kind of relationship going from your Y to X rather than the other way around. So I was wondering if you can kind of like maybe try to think about that more theoretically, and then kind of answer, just tell me why do you think this result is? Is it really being driven the other way around, or is there some theoretical issue involved, or something like that?
Yeah, so first on the theory point on why they are, localized units are more likely to be substitutes rather than, or more likely to be, why are they more likely to be complements rather than substitutes as we might expect? And this actually gets back to the point that I think they're doing two very different roles. On one hand, these localized village guards or civil defense forces are way cheaper than probably everybody in regular armed forces or gendarmerie. But on the other hand, they cannot do the same type of things. If we think about kind of the way that regular armed forces are trained and what operations they're being used for, it's unlikely that you could probably take one out, replace them, and get sort of the same outcomes. So I think on one hand, there are certain situations, and I think I have 4 or 5 cases in the dissertation where there are no where the state just completely lacks a regular military. And in those situations, you might expect that, in fact, like in Somalia, like there is a situation where related militias were in fact substitutes for the regular armed forces. I think outside of states that lack a regular military, I think among states though that do have a regular military, they are in fact using these other forces for other options. Because again, getting back to the point that you can't have 100,000 really expensive special operation units, and oh, by the way, you don't necessarily need that for everything, especially if you're doing something like trying to collect intelligence on who rebels are, right? Like having that super teched up lethal special operations unit might not be as great as someone who just happens to have formally worked or known these people. And so it seems like I need to kind of draw out that logic a little bit more on why these are used alongside each other and why you just can't substitute the two of them. And on the empiric side, I really like the idea of using a simpler model. Given that I'm already trying to work with different types of armed forces and different personnel measures, anything that will simplify an equation versus make it more complicated, I am behind, especially just running it with population. So I actually didn't run it with populations because it was so highly correlated with the military personnel numbers. So I removed it, but I like the idea of just presenting another set of equations without all those extra controls and just population. And then finally, for the contemporaneous effects one, so I think it's the case, especially when you have, again, potentially more conflicts happening or conflicts that you have to deploy more units, that these processes are slow moving for the state, so that things that happen the previous year are unlikely to affect the budgets, resource allocation, and personnel, specifically in government regulated units, until the following year. So like anyone who's ever done anything in government or not, these institutions do not respond immediately. So that's why I think we might be seeing these again happening in the following year following the emergence of these events.
Did you need to follow up on that?
Yeah, would that be okay?
Yeah, go ahead. And then I got Phil.
So one of the things with using lag variables, I mean, you have a theoretical reason to use them, and it's a good thing. But there is some issues that there is a paper. I mean, I don't know if it's a working paper. It's by Mark Bellamar et al. I don't know if it's forthcoming in JLP or not. But it's a working paper, and they actually talk about some of the issues of using lag variables versus using non-lag versions. And so it just might be worth kind of seeing, again, a way of preempting some of the physics. Yeah, in political science, people usually lag stuff under the presumption that it helps kind of prevent endogeneity, which a lot of times it actually doesn't. But in your case, you actually have a good reason to do that, right? And so maybe it's worth mentioning that and really flashing that out straight up, just telling people, here why I'm using a lag version. And then you don't have to include that robustness one, because the way it is now, it seems to kind of negate your argument in respect to the gendarmerie. So,
Phil.
So also on the issue of lag-dependent variables, do you have measures for gendarmerie forces prior to the conflict even beginning? I mean, I know you're only analyzing conflict states, but do you have the data? Okay, so I would be curious to see what would happen if you accounted for that, because I'm slightly concerned. This is probably not an issue, but it seems to me that there's at least some chance that countries that have a larger gendarmerie are the only ones that are willing to refuse demands from rebels that are in far-flung regions, and that there might be some selection effect where if you have a dissident group at the periphery that makes demands and you can't fight them, you give in, and you can fight them, you don't give in. And so we're seeing larger gendarmeries in countries that have conflicts in the periphery, because there wouldn't be a conflict in the periphery if they didn't have a large gendarmerie. The causal hour could be running in basically the exact opposite direction. That's probably not true. It's not like hard to imagine that they would raise larger forces during a conflict, but you could easily address that if you have the data available.
So one of the things that I have been thinking about and wanting to do are sort of thinking about three different select equations that I could have, because again, I have I have personnel variables for all three of these internal armed forces from 1970 through 2010, sort of regardless of whether or not a country has been exposed to conflict. And so one of the things I'm trying to think about is better ways to exploit that data to explain this and get Phil exactly at the issue you were thinking of. So I was trying to think through, like, do I need thinking through three different selection equations, or like an interaction term of conflict. Because I agree, I don't think it's likely, but it would also be nice to show that empirically as well.
It's a little harder to see that being an issue with militias. I don't think there are a lot of governments that maintain standing local militias, but at least with the gendarmerie, it would be worth looking at.
I have an open queue, except that I'm going to insert myself again. And so your answer to Orr's question about complement versus substitute makes me wonder why, if these localized, less regulated militias are so cheap and so effective, why don't states always have them, right? Why isn't that, why is there a tension at all? Why isn't that just something that you always would use for one type, for one area of the country or another? Why is that something that they would decide not to use?
Yeah, and I should, bring this, I think, up very clear in the paper too, on kind of what happens when you end up relying on these cheaper forces that you can be kind of hands off about. Is that first, they're not great in all operations. I kind of alluded to this with when you have to coordinate units or deploy them farther away, because there's not a strict hierarchical chain of command across these units. It can be really hard to get them to coordinate and move militias around. A lot of, I think, village guards do in fact have like trucks and ways to get around, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're easy to coordinate. as opposed to other forces, again, or like special operations units where they do have these chains of command that allow for coordination to actually achieve the objectives you're trying to address. And I also think that these are not, these less regulated militias are not necessarily a option that states willingly want to go to, all the time. This is not their first strategy. I looked in the paper at when, just briefly with descriptive statistics, when do we first see private militias start in civil conflict? And it's very rarely that they're starting, right at conflict onset, or like gendarmeries. Gendarmeries are oftentimes in peacetime or in conflict, but private militias tend to start a couple of years into conflict. And I think that's because there is sort of this partially capacity. They might be former insurgents driven to the state, and also they're not, useful in all situations, and they can be a huge risk to the government later on. So forces that you can't easily control and monitor could very quickly, turn on you. It's the time inconsistency problem too, that even if the government and the militia share the same preferences at time t, time t plus 1 plus 2, the preferences of these groups might be very different, and they could very easily return to be a threat to the population or to the government itself. And that could be something.
The last problem with them too that you're not really talking about.
Yeah, and I think that's the big sort of implications too for I would give to policy is, when you're relying on these local options, there can be huge downstream consequences for it, like again, local police. I don't think anyone thinks that was a long-term strategy that was good for civilians. So yeah, emphasizing that in the paper.
Well, we are about out of time. So if, do any of our discussants have any other major points that they'd like to bring up to Meredith? It seems like the gist of what, if I had to put an overall arc on, oh wait, Phil? Did Phil have something to say?
No, I was just saying I didn't have any other things to say.
Oh, okay. So that if I had to put a finger on what would be the big takeaway here is that we'd like to hear more about these informational problems. What are these problems? How do they relate to each other? Why are they such big problems? And why is it that these things solve them in the way that they do? So I mean, you certainly have these two literatures in this paper together, and I certainly they're related to one another. And I think that this is a nice way, looking at these kinds of allocations of forces is a nice way of looking at them. But I think that there's a need for a tighter connection between the trade-offs that are inherent in these decisions and how those trade-offs relate to the information and the salience of that information problem, et cetera. I'd also, in a very small point, I'd like to, your title doesn't make it super clear what this is about. I just so, when I was inviting discussants, I added a little bit about what the paper was about because I felt like it wasn't super obvious from the title. So you might think about how to make it more clear that state allocation of force doesn't mean where they're sending people or what they're paying them or what, whether, I mean, Phil has work on where you allocate funds and towards forces or towards arms or intelligence, right? There are lots of ways that we allocate things in conflict. And so you could have some clarity there. Do you have any comments that you'd like to wrap up with?
Oh yeah, maybe information challenges and just internal armed forces.
Yeah,
because that is actually what
great.
Said. So maybe changing it, you might see a future iteration under that title. These were really helpful, and again, the idea of digging into more what it means to have these different types of problems, what they are, and how they drive sort of the strategic decisions that governments make, and kind of putting that up front. So this was really helpful. I might be coming back to some of our other discussants with follow-up questions, but yeah, this was hugely helpful.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Meredith, for seeing your paper and for giving a great presentation today. Thank you to Phil and Aura and Tricia for graciously agreeing to participate and spending time reading the paper and thinking hard about it. So we really appreciate it. And this was a great discussion. If anyone is tuning in now or seeing this at the end, you can go back and watch a presentation at the beginning. I also recommend going to the online Peace Science Colloquium website, which you can reach through the Peace Science website. You can look at and read Meredith's paper and give her comments by email. And you can also check out the rest of the schedule for the semester. So we'll see everybody again in 2 weeks on October 7th, when Adrian Florea is going to present Rebel Governance and Empirical Test. So thank you all, and we'll see you again.